Your automation sequences that convert in Chicago just aren't going to perform in Tokyo.
Notably Japan, they wouldn't yet even want a dented can on the shelf
Mhm.
because they know the consumer will read dented can, dented product. Global success is more of a series of local wins rather than thinking what you're going to do in your headquarters is going to work all around the world. Don't do one size fits all, but learn how to brand global, adapt local.
There's inherent risk when you're running a local marketing campaign. There's inherent risk for starting a company. There's inherent risk in everything we do. The more that you could try to test the market, the safer you'll be and reap the rewards from what is becoming an increasingly global planet. Every time you internationalize your marketing, you face a choice. Duplicate what already works at home or adapt your marketing campaigns to a new market. According to CSA Research Can't Read Won't Buy study, 76% of global consumers prefer to buy products with information in their native language. And 40% of consumers won't even consider buying from a website in other languages. Yes, translation is important, but assuming that what works at home will connect abroad is a fallacy. Your automation sequences that convert in Chicago just aren't going to perform in Tokyo. So why do marketers struggle to adapt when crossing borders? The good news, it's not about rebuilding your tech stack. It's about adapting what you have. Germans respond to product specs. Brazilians connect through stories, and your tech and your team need to know those differences. So how do you cross borders with your marketing campaigns without rebuilding everything from scratch? I'm Benjamin Shapiro, and to explain how to make your marketing culturally intelligent is Katharine Melchior, who's the author of Brand Global, Adapt Local. Katharine has worked for international brands like Nike, Louis Vuitton, and Shiseido before becoming the president of Global Ally Consulting and a professor at the Haas School of Business. And today, she's going to share the playbook for how your marketing can cross borders. Katharine, welcome to the MarTech podcast.
Hi there.
Very excited to have you on the show and excited to talk to you about what you wrote the book on. Let's start off at the top. Tell me about what it means to brand global and adapt local.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's really exciting to be here and talk about this new book. It's my first book, so I'm really excited. And it's something that I've spent a career learning how to do. Basically, the idea is that Americans don't think globally first, but the world is more demanding than ever for cultural relevance. And winning brands do that. They think global, but they feel local. You mentioned a stat up there about how much people want something that responds to their values. And it's true, 77% of customers prefer to buy brands that share their values. But many brands take this kind of a one size fits all because it's easy and it's efficient until it's not. The bigger you get, the more you have to adapt to each of those markets individually, because otherwise you have costly missteps and ultimately lost revenue. And ultimately, if you break the trust, then you've got a really big long-term problem. So the reason we talk about cultural intelligence is that our world is just more interconnected than ever, but actually more culturally distinct. So that's the key for brands to remain relevant throughout their global reach.
It seems like if I had to summarize what you're saying is when you're thinking about your brand and sort of the original positioning, you need to think worldwide, right? You're thinking about a global brand, but when you are adapting to market conditions, that is not a universal condition. That is something that has to happen locally. So brand global, act local. When you're thinking about sort of foundationally or you're going through a transition, how do you set up a marketing department to understand not only how you are relevant across the globe, but how to understand and interpret data from local conditions?
It's a very astute question. I love to talk about the Samsung brand. If you think about it, at one point in the 1990s, Samsung was a provider of white label products for a lot of other people's brands. But today, Samsung is one of the top technology companies around the world known for premium brands. So imagine to go from putting other people's logo on a product to commanding top price. What they did is, and it's in my book, and I teach a class as I teach it in my class at Berkeley as well, is it's really an incredible transformation. And the global marketing department looked at the world in regions. They did studies and realized that they can't just do the same thing in different parts of the world. So they segmented the world in terms of where the brand was in its development, places where it was really well known and entrenched in a certain kind of positioning, which would take some difficulty to change, where it wasn't known at all, and where it could actually come into the market through white space. So when you're looking at the world, it's very helpful to break it into somewhat similar markets and then deal with maybe three kinds of regions in terms of global growth rather than countless.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about the segmentation, in sort of a worldwide perspective. And I'm assuming that a lot of the segmentation is, the Western world, the Eastern world, Latin America. It's like there are some common trends. But then when you get down to like Brazil versus Colombia, it seems like there are some dramatic cultural differences there. So when you're talking about Samsung as an example, they can't just be saying, okay, we're dividing the world into three pieces. It's like the risk board, there's the red, the yellow, and the blue, and everything is that simple. There is, the little individual countries and territories that are culturally different. How do you interpret that and still have a global perspective on what your brand should be?
Well, it's one of the complex aspects of why this is fascinating, and you have to be dexterous and you have to be curious. So you want to study each of those different of markets differently. It depends on the resources that you have, right? So there's a place in a continuum of a brand's growth where it's going to be doing the lowest common denominator, but at a certain point, it's going to need to distinguish that and adapt to each market if it wants to continue to grow and create and have market share, have dominant market share.
Let's walk through the playbook here. So, if you're a marketer and you're starting to think about crossing borders, let's make the assumption that you've got a national playbook for marketing something that's working. What is the playbook when you try to expand into other countries?
Yeah. It's kind of the same as you should start in your own country. You want to understand the market, one. Two, that requires research. And then once you understand whom your target market is, you want to adapt your products, distribution, positioning, communication, service to that market. The challenge is that often the market isn't right next to you or right around you. And so learning to recognize that it may be different, to just first understand that it is likely to be different. And then you can work on how it's different. But I have worked for a number of companies, and I would spend a lot of time trying to explain to people that consumers in Japan were reacting differently to certain products than they would in the United States. And I wanted to just get past that and get to the actual work rather than working internally to convince people of the need to adapt.
I understand the market. Yeah, of course. I want to dig deeper. How? How, if I am an American, I don't speak Japanese, I've been to Japan twice in my life, how do I understand the cultural differences and the buying behaviors without actually having been there? What are the resources that you rely on to, A, investigate the opportunity of the market, and B, if I'm going to actually try to get into that market, understand those cultural differences that are going to give me the best foothold?
Again, I'm not going to say anything that's different than how you might approach a new market in your domestic country. You're going to start with quantitative and qualitative research, right? Start from the broad and work your way in. So the easiest thing is to start with a bunch of existing quant research that will tell you how the market is broken up economically, age-wise, demographically, all of those kinds of statistics, and try to see what your competitors might be doing in that market. If you have competitors, if you are disrupting an industry, you might have white space and trying to figure out where you're going to make your product land. So you start on the broad level, on the quantitative side, and then you work your way into the qualitative side, which is where I think it's really exciting, because then when you get into the qualitative is where the magic happens, because that's where you're trying to discern how people really use products or make purchasing decisions differently than we might do in our own country. For instance, packaging. Packaging is one of these aspects of a purchasing of a product that is very important in certain markets, and in other markets not at all. Like if you were to go to the grocery store and you were buying a can of beans and there was a slight dent on that outside part of the can, would you even notice it? Would you care? What would you think about the brand and the peas on the inside? In certain markets, notably Japan, if you have, they wouldn't even want a dented can on the shelf, because they know the consumer will read dented can, dented product. If you're not going to take enough care to make sure that your packaging arrives properly, how can I be assured you're going to take a certain kind of care on the way the product is made or delivered or serviced if I have a problem?
Yeah, it's funny using that as an example. Maybe this is the cultural difference, and it's where I struggle to understand how to know these nuances. In Japan, the association is dented can, bad product. Here, I would assume dented can, bad grocery store. Right? I'm not actually blaming the bean canner. It's the guy that put it on the shelf, dropped it, and wasn't paying close enough attention. And so I don't know if that's, survey sample size of one, but, to me, I'm not associating the neglect of the can and the packaging with the manufacturer. It's the distributor. So it doesn't necessarily mean I think that the product is therefore bad. And so when you're thinking about honestly, when I think about globalization, and a million years ago, I worked for this company called eBay, that they were in a lot of different countries, didn't actually sell physical products, but a lot of translation and a lot of work. But eBay meant different things in different places. And we had these local country managers that was trying to understand these nuances and position the marketplace. But one of the challenges was always the translation piece. And it was, to me, it's like if I'm thinking about expanding globally, honestly, my head goes to what are the closest parallels to the existing culture we have so we can use the existing playbook and existing language as much as possible. So I'm going from US to Canada to the UK to Australia, and probably like obviously you have to factor in your distribution, and Australia is really far away, and can you get your products there? But to me, there's like an ease of migration of what's working. How much should you prioritize being able to replicate what you know is working, as opposed to doing these studies and hoping that you can learn the culture?
I think it depends on where the brand is in its growth, and how different the market is from your domestic market. There's a framework that I like a lot called CAGE, which is an acronym. So it's about cultural, administrative, geographic, and E is for economic. And what are those various distances between two countries? So let's say the United States and China. If you're going to be shipping steel, for a product that's in the news these days.
Boy, that's a loaded example.
Yeah, right. So obviously the geographic distance is going to have a huge cost that's implicit in it. But for China, if you're looking at Airbnb, for example, which is another example in my book, obviously there's not really a geographic difference. And even you might say economic difference. Well, there's probably a similar target there. But the administrative challenge with China and the cultural challenge or distance with China are huge. So in fact, Airbnb, that went into the market around 2014, 15, and you have, imagine in those days in China, you have this huge travel market. You have a young digitally savvy consumer. And you even had some competitive home sharing businesses emerging. So Airbnb that had strategic investors in China had kind of everything you would think to be able to go in there. Well, 2014, 6 years later, they actually 7 years later, they actually pulled out in 2022. So some of the problems were in China, Chinese travelers didn't trust the apartment photos. Trust is a huge cultural difference between Chinese consumers and American consumers. Now, granted, home sharing didn't start easily in the United States either, right? There was a question: am I going to get into this guy's Uber? Am I going to actually sleep in strangers, room? But Americans didn't have the same distance to a stranger that Chinese do. The Chinese did not feel comfortable staying in a stranger's house. They didn't trust the photos in there. They didn't want to do the cleaning. They're like, they didn't want to have to pay. They didn't want to clean on their vacation. And then
Hmm.
there's another issue is that they didn't have a credit system. So the hosts weren't sure that people were going to pay. So you have all these various challenges. Now the local competitors knew these challenges, and they innovated very, very rapidly. Now we're very proud of our tech businesses, and we think that they innovate quite rapidly. But when you're competing in China, and you're smiling, so maybe you know and you've had that experience, when you're
Yeah.
competing in China, speed is on a whole different pace. They respond very, very quickly, and Chinese competitors respond very quickly. So as I said, in the end, Airbnb pulled out of China. It's kind of an amazing story. But there are other examples too, like Home Depot went to China too. And there's the same cultural challenge that they faced, because we love Home Depot because it's like, do it yourself, save some money. Now, saving money is another principle that the Chinese actually like. They're also
Hmm.
very cost oriented, but labor is cheap in China. So the do it yourself in America was like, no, no, do it for me. I'm going to just hire other people to build my home furnishings because it's cheap. So that's a huge cultural gap in terms of entering the market and how you want to enter the market.
You're on a roll here with great examples of times that brands have fallen down. The first one that comes to my mind is the Chevy Nova trying to go to Mexico, where Nova was interpreted as Nova, which is no go. Give me some other examples of brands that have tried to cross borders and failed.
Yeah, there are a lot of them. When we talk about understanding the naming one, because you talked about translation early with eBay, that's a big challenge, and I think the Chevy Nova stands as one of the most famous examples of Nova. But you have companies that have really learned from this. Now, Coca-Cola is an example that I like to cite, because Coca-Cola went to Peru. And I went to Peru many years ago as a teenager, and I drank this local cola called Inca Cola, Inca for the indigenous people in Peru. And they're super proud of this Inca Cola. Everywhere there was Inca Cola. And so Coca-Cola actually struggled to gain a foothold because of this strong local competitor and the pride of the people. Similarly, now that was a long time ago, we might come back around to Coca-Cola because it's learned a lot since then. But even more recently, Starbucks did the same thing going into Australia. I mean, come on, right? Like, you would think that Starbucks would be able to study the market in Australia to realize there is a very developed coffee culture in Australia with lots of local coffee cafes that were strong. And so Starbucks came in, and then it didn't realize there was the kind of competition that it had, and it came in as overpriced and couldn't compete, and they lost hundreds of millions of dollars until they kind of stopped, closed all these stores, and had to rethink how they were going to go about it. So you think that people will learn from the 60s when Chevy Nova went trying to go into Mexico, but it happens all the time. And it can be language, it can be taste, it can be culture, um, and often it's about understanding your competitors and getting your product, your positioning, your pricing, your distribution right.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Coca-Cola and Starbucks because when I think of brands that have mastered internationalization, like those are two brands absolutely at the top of my list, specifically Coca-Cola. And I'm sure that in different markets they've had different challenges. Obviously, Peru, they might have had some local competition. Tell me more about which brands have mastered internationalization and what can we learn from them?
Well, let's go back to Coca-Cola because I shouldn't pick on it. I like Coca-Cola and what they have done because I also like some of the Coca-Cola products outside of the US better than I like them in the US. Because what have they done? They have learned to adjust their sugar levels to sweetness
Hmm.
preferences, because sweetness preferences are different around the world. When we get to taste, so you have Starbucks, we have that one, there's Coca-Cola. Another one of my favorite ones is KitKat that adapts its product to different markets. So if we finish with Coca-Cola, they adapt their sweetness to different regions. It's
Who's got the biggest sweet tooth? I'm assuming that's the United States.
the Americans
Yeah.
have very high sweet tooth, and it's a different kind of sugar. That's the other thing. So if you live in California, many people know there is hecho en Mexico, which is the
Yep,
Coca-Cola that they
Mexican Coke
have.
in the bottle.
Mexican Coke in the bottle.
Yeah.
First of all, it comes in a bottle. Second of all, it uses real sugar versus fructose. So the
Hmm.
flavor is different. It's not only less sweet in Mexico, but it is a different quality of sweetness.
Hmm.
So, and then you get to taste it in the bottle. So, for instance, that's a really great one. They've learned to do that. It's not only the level of sweetness that Coca-Cola has changed, they actually create different kinds of products. Do you know that we're going back to Japan again? I did spend 9 years in Japan, so I know a lot about the Japanese market and a lot about the nuances of how brands have adjusted there.
Yep.
Coca-Cola is the single largest provider of canned coffee in Japan. It's incredible. They
That's
launched
funny.
a
I would have
brand.
assumed it was Starbucks.
Canned coffee? No,
Yeah.
it's Coca-Cola. So they leveraged once they figured this out, they launched a product called Georgia Coffee. Remember, it's from Atlanta. Coca-Cola is from Atlanta, Georgia.
Right.
So it's called Georgia Coffee. And they leveraged their distribution of vending machines. So they put it right in their own vending machines all around the country. And then they learned what people liked. And so now, if you go to a vending machine in Japan, you're going to find all of these versions of Georgia coffee with these different kinds of sweetness. And then they have milk coffee or non-milk coffee or dark coffee. So Coca-Cola has actually learned a lot, and it's always innovating different kinds of products for different markets. But they're not alone.
There's
As
some
I
real
said,
irony there before you go on that
yep.
Georgia, not necessarily a place that I think of having a lot of coffee plantations, is known as essentially the brand of coffee in Japan. Who knew?
Yeah, I know it is. It is actually quite funny. But if you think of it as related to just the corporate brand, it's very easy to make sense if you know it's from
Yeah.
Atlanta. So another one that I like, and it's not an American brand, is Nestle from Switzerland. So
Hmm.
they own the chocolate bar KitKat. You had a KitKat.
Yeah. Give me a break. Break me off a piece of
Give
that
me
Kit
a
Kat
break.
bar.
Give me a KitKat. So what do you know about those KitKats? Like, what are you always expecting to find when you open that cover?
Melted chocolate.
In what shape?
Maybe. They're the two bars that are waffly. I don't know how to describe
Right.
it, but
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. They're waffles and they're in these sticks. Like you either
Hmm.
get two
Yeah.
sticks or four sticks. So they keep that the same, but then they change the nature of the chocolate, the sweetness of the chocolate, and they'll change the packaging, but they'll keep the red Kit Kat on top. So, um, not that I want to keep talking about Japan all the time, but it happens to be the place where they have the most. There are over 300 varieties of Kit Kat chocolates in Japan, everything like matcha and sake and azuki bean. But even in other places like in Malaysia.
Yeah.
So there's an incredible story about Malaysia during COVID when people started to eat more dark chocolate. And there was also a supply chain shortage. So what the team of KitKat Malaysia did is they realized that rather than sourcing cocoa from Africa, Ghana, most of the cocoa plants are from Ghana, they realized that Borneo was its own rainforest in the country of Malaysia. And so they worked in Malaysia locally to be able to source cocoa beans locally, and they made a local chocolate which was dark chocolate, which was also appealed more to the Malaysian flavor. So they named this dark Borneo, and I believe it's 50%, where you put the percentage of how much dark cocoa is in it on the package. And it again appealed to people's local pride that it actually came from their local rainforest, and sold out very quickly.
How do we take some of the examples of the failures that you mentioned and some of the successes and come up with some common threads? So if you're looking for some themes across what works and what doesn't, give me some examples marketers can take home with them.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to come back to where we started, which is study the market, right? Study the market is really important. And I would say with that, use cultural intelligence. All right. So cultural intelligence, I think, is not as widely understood today, but with everything that's going on with AI and simple personalization, the notion of cultural intelligence becomes even important today to create brands with lasting value that appeal to people's culture. So that is your competitive edge. Then you have to learn how to, what I call, master the art of freedom within a frame, knowing when to adapt, whether it's your taste or your marketing or your packaging, and then when to stay the same, when to keep that frame the same for your logo, your core product, maybe your colors. And so knowing that balance of, if you're in the corporate side, allowing your teams locally to have that freedom, but setting up a frame of what is adaptable and what is untouchable. That's the key. So it's really helpful to think about how global success is more of a series of local wins, rather than thinking what you're going to do in your headquarters is going to work all around the world.
The world is about 8,000 miles in diameter. And I think for a long time, marketers have always assumed that the farthest places you can go are the hardest ones to expand to. It's shrinking. And not only in terms of our ability to get products to different places, to manufacture around the world, the distribution is becoming easier. The technology allows us to connect and market to people, but there is still this gap of culture that we struggle. And it doesn't seem like that's getting any closer, right? We're not necessarily getting to this homogenized world culture, but where we do have an advantage now is our ability to study and understand. One of the things that pops into my head when we think about internationalization is how much artificial intelligence can help us with this. Things like ChatGPT's deep research, right? Understanding the major cultural nuances. This used to be set up a team in Japan, train them, immerse them in the culture, and have them study the market, and then come back 6 months or a year later and decide if you want to expand there. It doesn't have to be like that anymore. We could start studying and we can start learning how to adapt our existing brand to local conditions without having to fly around the world.
Yeah.
Katharine, I want to move on into our lightning round, where we're going to ask a series of questions related to this week's topic, which is culturally intelligent marketing. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, here we go. Number one, toss up. If you had to choose, would you focus your brand on hyper-personalization or building a global brand identity?
You have to have the right idea at the right time. So I say global brand identity first, and then hyper-personalization.
I feel like there's risk there, right? Assuming that you can have a global brand, like that seems to be something that's like, well, think about your brand and how it adapts to the entire world. That's not easy, right? Coca-Cola spent years and probably billions of dollars marketing to establish a global brand identity. Hyper-personalization seems like it's a lot easier to implement. So help me balance the challenge of actually thinking about a global brand, but making one that is actually globally relevant instead of personalizing to somebody who's in your market right here and that you know their needs.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you're selling to that person right here, then great. You can hyper personalize that to them right in front of you. I think the question is you're looking for economies of scale as you're trying to grow. So to do hyper personalization all around the world is impractical and not effective. Your ROI is really bad. So you have to, that's why you have to balance it. That's why there's the book, because there are certain things that you can leverage globally. And the more they recognize, again, like the KitKat, as more they recognize that red KitKat circle on a bar that might have a different picture behind it, the more you are you've already capitalized on brand awareness, and so they're more likely to try your product. So if you start with hyper personalization, you're just going to always having to be building brand awareness over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think know thyself is a rule for marketers. And I do think that you have to understand whether your brand has global aspirations, whether you have national aspirations, whether you're a specific market, whether you're not going to internationalize, you're not actually going to expand long term. If you're setting up an e-commerce brand and you're making t-shirts for people in Southern California, you probably want to go with hyper personalization, right? You're going to like Kobe for life t-shirts. If you're thinking about creating a global basketball brand that's going to be playing the sport all around the world, well, you probably need to think about something that's applicable in the US, in China, in Japan, and in Europe as well. So obviously market conditions matter, but also the aspirations of your business as well. Let's move on to our second question: double down or diversify. Are you doubling down on a unified global marketing team or diversifying into local marketing managers?
I say local marketing managers you train, because a mix of individuals has been proven to deliver higher results, and those people make one another smarter. So the reason I say train them is because you want to have a global culture. You want to ultimately be able to have shared values and open communication, because the key to build globally powerful, diverse teams is trust. And in order to build trust, you need three things. You have shared values, and the only way you can build shared values is if you really are explicit about what your values are. You need to have open communication so that you can each share when you think someone's gone too far. And you have to have a history of promises kept. When you can develop those three pillars and have it work, then yeah, you can integrate local managers to be able to collaborate together for a global team.
Yeah, here's my experience. When I worked at eBay, it's been about 20 years since I was there, but there obviously are international markets, right? There's eBay's in 30 countries, or was at the time. And we would have a local marketing team that was running their own marketing campaigns because they had the inherent market knowledge. And then we would consolidate everything because we wanted the economies of scale and the bidding optimization to happen globally. And then inherently we would go back. And then inherently we would go the other way, and back and forth and back and forth. And there was these global managers, and then there's the national managers, and there's the global managers, the global and national, and it just went on. And there was this cycle of who was responsible for doing what that just seemingly never ended. And my answer was always, okay, we need an Italian, a German, an Australian, everybody here in one location, and then we have the cultural understanding of the entire world, but we're operating at a global team. So basically, I wanted to localize the national team, or at least I thought that was the solution. Is that a common problem? Is that just an eBay problem? Or, when you're thinking about, do I want everybody in one place or do I want regional teams, do they generally stick?
Did you localize the global team or did you globalize the local team?
Well, we did both, right? It went back and forth. It was when I first got to eBay, there was individual country managers that had their own budget for marketing. Then it was consolidated. Then the local marketing managers got more resources. And so it sort of went back and forth who controlled the budget. And there was never a real lasting decision of who was going to run the entire marketing program, the local team or the global team.
Sounds like a tech company.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. I think, well, who controls the budget controls everything. We all know that. I think the key, so it's interesting. In this book, I interviewed people from all over the world about their work internationally. And what was amazing is how much they learned from their colleagues all over the world and from working internationally, just like you said. So I would say the notion is that we all become globally aware and culturally intelligent so that you can have diverse ideas and understanding of diverse customer segments in any place, be it in Silicon Valley or in Saigon. That way everyone everywhere is open-minded and recognizes that things are not the same way in one market or another.
All right, I want to move on to our next question. Trend or trash? Would you say it's trend or trash that using AI as the first step to understanding consumer behaviors in a new market?
Of course, it's trend, and it's a trend that's working, let's be honest, but it needs guardrails, like everything. It needs context. And this is one of the things that we learn in cross-cultural work and global work is that so much of it is context. And it's actually the one thing that AI can't do. I know because my son is getting a PhD at the intersection of human and artificial intelligence at Colorado University of Boulder. So I have learned this through him about how AI is really good at a lot of things, but it doesn't necessarily get context, which is why you see lots of innovation of companies taking multiple linear AI directions and then stitching it together horizontally in order to try to solve that problem. So that's where you need the human interface, either in the setup or in the review. So you can ask AI language learning models all kinds of questions, and they can certainly help you do a lot of that initial legwork. And then you have to look at it again and you have to check it because, as we know, a lot of lies come out of AI. And you don't want to risk your brand on something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. And I've been doing this a lot. Maybe this is more of a general marketing research question than it is specifically about localization and globalization. But AI is a wonderful tool for putting together these deep, well, I'm thinking about deep research from OpenAI, but this, sophisticated, well thought out, maybe full of shit reports. And, I've been doing research on podcasting and how people evaluate podcasts and the nature of our business and our production company. And, I go to GPT. And if I was going to expand into other languages, I'm sure I would, or other, countries, I'm sure I would say, okay, GPT, let's do some deep research and tell me about the Japanese podcast consumption behaviors and who's producing the podcast. But you have to fact check everything you're doing. So is it even worth the research, or do you just have somebody that has the cultural context to know? It's not very clear, but it sounds like you're like, yes, this is something that people are doing. We should continue. But trust but verify seems to be the common denominator.
I think so. I mean, I don't want to take away, that's where even if you work with people from different markets, they're going to be using AI too, but they'll have the knowledge to be able to check it, right? So that the key is to get the human experts as close to the area of under discussion to be able to verify it and work together, right? You want AI to be your teammate.
I think that's a great way to put it. You want AI to be your teammate. Okay, last question for you. Game plan. What's your game plan for prioritizing international markets as your brand expands?
Sometimes it can be easy and sometimes it can be hard. If you have international customers in your domestic market, that's a very good place to start to learn from. Figure out where they're from and why they like your product. What kind of benefit does it provide to them that they don't have in their own market? So you can always learn from your existing market. You might study zip codes and see what kinds of demographic profiles they have and if there might be similar demographic profiles in a foreign country. Again, use that CAGE framework that I talked about with the 4 different kinds of distance: cultural, administrative, geographic, and economic, to be able to determine which might be more likely favorable markets and which might be more challenging. And I think back to the local market, whether you have foreign visitors or local visitors, we have lots of micro communities in the United States. We're actually blessed with an incredibly diverse population here at home if we see them that way. The challenge is to remember that no 2 customers are exactly the same, but you want to try to create segments of like-minded customers and figure out how you can learn from them. There's a lot we can learn in the United States.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. 2 things come to mind. One, you mentioned the CAGE acronym, which is measuring the distance, not just in terms of geography, but culturally, economically. I forgot what the A was. What was the A?
Administrative. How
Administrative.
opaque or transparent are the systems, payments,
Right.
legal?
Yeah. Is it logistically possible for you to actually sell in a different country? And that sort of calculus should help you figure out what are the right markets, but also learning from your local market. If you have a high percentage of Hispanic consumers, thinking about expanding to Latin America might make a lot of sense. But that has one underlying assumption, which I think could be dangerous. It's thinking that if somebody is Hispanic in the United States, their behaviors are similar to what they might be at home. There's obviously a cultural difference between people that emigrate to the United States as opposed to stayed in, their local country, or the original country, native country, I should say. How do you make sure that you're factoring in, there's the Latin American, Japanese American, African American, that's different than people from Africa. How do you make sure that you're interpreting the right cultural signals?
Yeah. You have to always second guess yourself, right? Question yourself. Don't take things for granted. Don't assume that you don't want to assume that people are going to be buying the product for the same reasons as they are in Los Angeles as they are in Louisiana. And in the same respect, you don't want to think that a Hispanic consumer in San Diego is going to respond the same way as a local Colombian consumer in Bogota. But you can learn certain things. There are certain values that may be similar, but it becomes the first place to study, right? And so you want to go in with that skeptical mindset of saying, what can I learn here? What do I want to see? What do I want to study then in another market? And so you have your assumptions kind of laid out for you right there. And then you want to go in and remember their assumptions. Don't take them for granted and just expect that they're going to be identical. Don't do one size fits all, but learn how to brand global, adapt local.
Fundamentally, when you think about expansion and you're thinking about crossing borders, there's inherent risk. There's inherent risk when you're running a local marketing campaign. There's inherent risk for starting a company. There's inherent risk in everything we do. The more that you can be prepared, the more that you can do your homework, the more that you could try to test the market, the safer you'll be and reap the rewards from what is becoming an increasingly global planet. All right, that wraps up this episode of the MarTech podcast. Thanks to Katharine Melchior, the president of Global Ally, for joining us. If you'd like to get in touch with Katharine, you can find a link to her LinkedIn profile in our show notes. You could visit her website, which is Katharine Melchior, or you could find her book, Brand Global, Adapt Local, on Amazon. And if you'd like a daily stream of marketing and technology knowledge in your podcast feed, hit the subscribe button in your podcast app or follow us on YouTube. All right, that's it for today, but until next time, my advice is to just focus on keeping your customers happy.